Hey film fans, this is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and welcome to my ongoing coverage of punk cinema in this little mini-series I'm doing over the end of the summer and into the autumn. For this video, I'm really excited to have my first special guest on the channel. Her name is Dr Temmuz Gürbüz, and she has a PhD in film studies from the National University of Ireland in Galway. And I've been lucky enough to see Temmuz present on punk cinema a couple of times, and it's always fascinating to hear what she has to say. In fact, if I'm honest, the whole idea for doing this series on the channel kind of came out of watching Temmuz present at a conference we both attended in May this year. So I'm really excited to have her on the channel. She's a doctor of punk. We'll find out what that means. And yeah. Welcome, Temmuz. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Aaron. And your kind words, obviously. I'm very humbled.
Yeah, it's all well deserved. Your work is really great, and I hope a few of my viewers, at least anyway, will check it out later, and we'll post some of that in the comments, and we'll talk about it at the end of the video. So let's get into it. How did you get into punk, and what's the connection between punk and cinema for you?
So I've been playing in bands for a long time, and where I come from in Turkey, also now in Ireland as well, and somewhat involved in the punk subculture in both places. And I'm also like a cinephile. So when I was doing my master's, I was like kind of thinking of the ways how I can combine my both interests, where it feels quite personal to me and like part of my perhaps identity even. So it felt right to kind of, go have a bit of a research on punk and history of punk, and how I can, where are the connections between cinema and punk, basically. And that's how my research came about. But also there's like a minor detail where I was doing my MA thesis on a French film called Besmo, which I consider as like one of like the most punk films that I've ever seen. And I wasn't actually looking at its like punkness. I was looking at the gender politics in the film. And then my supervisor at the time was like, this aesthetics of this film is like quite punk actually. And would you consider looking at the aesthetics itself rather than just the politics in the film? And then I developed a PhD project later on, an extension of that thought process. So that's how I ended up doing like a big research on punk cinema. Hope this answers the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. What are some, I didn't tell you I was going to ask you this, what are some differences between punk scenes in Turkey and punk scenes in Ireland? Or is punk is it the same everywhere you go?
I mean, it's never the same everywhere you go. Of course not. I guess like there are commonalities. Obviously, it's the do it yourself, the way the gigs are organized, the way people make music and record them, and it's like it's a bit of a network, and where people kind of try to support each other, I guess, and create like space where doing punk feels available to everybody in the subculture, in the environment. So it's like basically the idea of collectivity, I guess, is like kind of common everywhere. But in terms of like the diversity, for example, of the scene can change from place to place. The kind of experience you have with the scene can change, and like there's like this whole this issue of like nostalgia, the older punks dissing the younger punks, and younger punks like being angry at the older punks kind of thing is kind of, I think, everywhere. You can find it online as well, the online communities and the websites that try to like find what are the best punk albums of all time, and then kind of people debating over that forever. Not necessarily interested in that, but I feel like we're gonna make some lists in this video as well. So
we might. I mentioned in one of my videos that I'm a little older than you. I remember very clearly, kind of in the middle 90s, debating Green Day with people, because the older punks were like, oh my God, come on, you guys. There's nothing punk about them. But younger people who were first discovering it were like, it's so punk, I love it so much. Or Rancid maybe is a better example, because they were kind of on the border of major label and that sort of stuff. And I was kind of right in the middle generation, you know, so I could see, I mean, like, their songs sound good, but it doesn't seem to be the same to me as the 70s and early 80s, but I wasn't there, so I don't know. But that discussion that you mentioned about like the older generation and the younger generation, who gets to decide and who gets to define it?
Yeah, totally. I mean, that's a thing, actually. Like, it's connected to the discussion of what is mainstream, what is underground, and we need to, I think, be open for these terms to be more like transformable in time, because nothing stays the same. So obviously, the social environment and whatever is happening in the world at the time affects the way subcultures are formed and reformed over time. So it's important to keep that in mind, that it's like not like a fixed, I guess, fixed term that you can actually find like a specific definition and stick with it. It doesn't work that way.
Oh my God, you totally undermined my next question. But like, I also mentioned this in one of my videos, that it is hard to define punk, but you sort of know it when you see it, or you know it when you hear it. I was walking down the street. I told this story in one of my videos in Dublin a few weeks ago, and I saw a guy with a bright pink mohawk, and I said to my son, hey, look at the punker. Like, there was no thought process. It was just, that's punk, sort of. But maybe he's not punk. Maybe he just likes bright pink mohawk. I don't know, but there's these superficial indicators, but then there is something like deeper that ties 1976 to 1996 to today. You were listening to Riot Girls. That's kind of mid 90s stuff, right? So if you had to say like punk is, like, how do you think you would define it? Or what is it for you? Like, when you think about punk aesthetics, punk cinema, all that kind of stuff. It's a big question, I know, but when somebody asked you, when you described your thesis, I'm writing about punk aesthetics, and someone says, oh, what's that? What is that?
I guess what you mentioned there, the pink mohawk, is like, it's a symbol. It's some sort of a sign, a marker of an aesthetic. That's why I like thinking about punk in terms of aesthetics, and that's why I titled my thesis that way, because it gives like kind of, you know, aesthetics give the term, or the plural aesthetic, not just aesthetic, but aesthetics kind of give room to thinking of the term itself in terms of difference and different diverse ways. And I think the pink mohawk comes to mind when we think about the term punk, or when we see a pink mohawk, we think about the term punk, because it's been stabilized through reiterated and retold stories and images and histories of punk. So it's kind of a symbol in that way. But we have to like keep in mind that symbols don't necessarily bring the multiplication of meanings, like what it could be there in terms of punk. So we don't expect the pink mohawk to define punk. But we think about punk when we see it. So there's like that, you know, that relation is a bit complicated there. It's not just, you know, an equation. So I guess when it comes to punk cinema, or what is punk, the question of what is punk is kind of, for me, or after like digging deep into the history of the subculture, like the, you know, the standard histories of, you know, the late 70s London and New York, and you know, is it the Stooges, or is it the Sex Pistols? You know, is it the Malcolm McLaren made the Sex Pistols, or was it the music, or did they, you know, were they still punk after they signed a big record label, or, you know, those debates are still circulated, and still kind of with the question in terms of Green Day is the same. So I think there is like this relationship between when counterculture becomes mainstream, and why that process happens. It's not actually just about punk, but I think punk defines that transition of trying to express a certain emotion and experience in a dominant culture within the restrictions of that culture, and seeing, like, using those restrictions in a way that feel like that might damage that dominant culture. So I think I kind of think about, you know, the environmental conditions. So, okay, I don't have enough money to buy a really good guitar, so I'm just gonna get a secondhand one, which is gonna sound less, you know, it's not gonna sound as good as like a better guitar, basically. So it's that kind of relation where, you know, there are like a lot of restrictions around you in terms of how you can make music, how you can write, how you can create art. And when you start using those like badly formed or reformed or secondhand or do-it-yourself type things, there's a certain aesthetic to that. It's like cluttered. It's a bit not like, it's hard to define it as beautiful in that way, you know, like I'm using that term in brackets, but it's kind of something that you want to create out of restrictions to be able to express yourself. Is like, I kind of define punk with the activity itself and the conditions within which you can create. And then obviously mainstream always seeks for new voice, and new voice generally comes from the underground. So there's always that risk of, like, you know, that underground punk music to be incorporated into the mainstream, and that is inevitable to a point. And so I'm not necessarily dismissive of that, but that's kind of like the dynamic that's been there for a long time, and it's not specific to punk, you know.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. It's rock music at the same discussion, or hip hop at the same, you know, when you think about like music genres, they generate, like, especially the music genres that have like subcultures around them, and certain behavioral codes and dress codes and certain dynamics that are specific to that music culture. That debate is always there, because mainstream likes to simplify things to a symbol and to a marker, so that it's quite easier to kind of, you know, understand that way when we have those symbols. So, and then these terms, or like cultures, subcultures, end up being reduced to those symbols that were created by the dominant history, the dominant stories in there. So we think about punk, we think about like spiky head young boy, for example, or like a mohawk, like you said,
safety pins, torn clothes,
so safety,
sort of
like all
t-shirts with writing on them.
So like
I wanted to kind of follow up there, because I feel like there's a lot of different tensions in punk, and there's one that I think you kind of alluded to there, and there's two characteristics, I would say, and you can tell me if you agree or not, that are almost always part of a punk subculture. And one is a kind of anti-establishment feeling, or anti-mainstream, or something like that. And then there's this sense of maybe marginalization or alienation or something, which creates a desire or a need to be heard. I think that's one of the important parts of a lot, maybe not all, but a lot of punk subcultures, is that sort of inclusivity of, like, if you want to be a part of it, you're a part of it. And I know a lot of punkers, I don't know if you had this experience, who in their teen years felt like this was kind of their first real family or something like that. It's this vibe of meeting these like-minded people who are also kind of on the margins. But what I see is maybe a tension in there, and you can agree or disagree, is that if you're anti-establishment or anti-mainstream, but you want to be heard, that's where that in that space, the kind of your voice can become commodified, because Warner Brothers or Geffen or EMI will come to you and say, we can get your voice, we can get your records to more people if you sign on the line. Something like that. Is that a fair assessment, do you think?
I think you summarized it really well. I think if there is room in those big studios to be able to, like, you know, give freedom to that expression, I guess that's the question for people who want their voice to be heard. But then, you know, are they gonna lose that voice in the way? That's the kind of risk I think people sometimes, you know, like, are willing to take, or sometimes not, you know. And I think it ultimately depends on how you relate to that system. But I think you summarized it really well there in terms of, like, you know, the tension.
Yeah. I think there's also an interesting tension. We don't have to talk too much about this because I want to get into the cinema stuff, but punk has this weird, not weird, wonderful kind of inclusivity that I mentioned, in this kind of family vibe. And it's, a lot of punk scenes have been historically open to, you know, people of color and queer communities. And they have this sort of, I mean, they've influenced it heavily, as I suppose you write about, but there's also an interesting kind of gatekeeping around punk. And there's another tension there that I find curious. And that comes back to the sellout, or the what is or isn't punk, and I get to decide, and that sort of thing. Yeah.
You know, I think it's important to be, like, a bit, maybe a little bit skeptical or a bit distant to the authority. And punk is supposed to be anti-authoritarian, and then some people say that they are the authority about to decide what punk can be. So, and then that can be a bit tricky to then discuss what punk can mean to people. And like I said, and you articulated really well, that those histories are intersecting heavily, actually, when you look at it. When you look at the term itself, like, the etymology of the term punk comes from, like, a kind of slang and homosexual behavior, you know? And it was used in a derogatory way in different settings, including prisons or the streets, or it kind of goes even back to, I think, Shakespeare even, I think, used the term in a different way. Like, it meant a prostitute.
Really? Okay.
Yeah. And then it started to become about rant boys and all that. And that's how, like, the punk actually, like, the term itself comes from the, you know, countercultural sexual behavior, and how the society kind of, like, labeled different people, outsiders. Outsiders, or, you know, people who cannot comply with social norms. So like, it's important to acknowledge that. I think that it's like, that's what I argue as well. That's, like, I think queerness is kind of ingrained in how punk came about, and then those kind of aspects of punk, I think, have been, like, written out of the kind of generic histories. And I actually, like, I'm sure you know about this, like, John Savage, who wrote England's Dreaming, about the history of Sex Pistols. He says that, like, there's still a book to be written about the dark gay punk scene, you know, that's, like, people that didn't necessarily talk about that. There was like a gay punk scene, actually, that was in London
in 76,
alongside the kind of whole Sex Pistols and you know, the sex shop and all that. And actually, like, the Buzzcocks and Sex Pistols were like very engaged with the aesthetics of the fetish gay culture at the time, and the kind of, you know, all that ripped, torn clothing kind of is not necessarily, you know, their invention or punk's invention.
Of course. It's interesting because the first film I talked about, I've only done one video about film so far, is Jubilee, you know, the Derek Jarman film, I think you know. And it is skeptical of punk authority, as you were just describing. I mean, it's very skeptical of punk and punk's potential for fascism and all of that. And you know about the Vivienne Westwood t-shirt.
I wrote about that. Yeah.
Okay. And so one of her criticisms of the film is that it's a gay film. And that seemed to me so odd because her whole shop is a gay shop, you know? And then she's saying like, oh, this is just gay boy stuff or something like that as a criticism of the film, which I think
she said that Jarman was like doing, being all like kind of sentimental about the kind of glitter and the diamonds and all that, because in Jubilee, actually, there's like Queen Elizabeth time travels to the punk London.
Right.
A diamond is missing, and then punks find it and they put the crown on their head and all that. And I think Vivienne Westwood was kind of like criticizing the kind of fascination with monarchic kind of, you know, like aesthetics and shininess and the aristocracy, who kind of manages to, you know, be inserted into the punk aesthetic, which is, I think, like it makes so much sense to me that Jarman combined the two, because it's ultimately dealing with the history of oppression, you know.
Right.
And then but Vivienne Westwood was like, that like actually defined it as gay, and I think she was right, like, you know. But it's funny that she dismissed it.
Yeah, that's the thing that I found interesting about it, is that I think some of her criticisms about his fascination with this kind of older, pastoral, pristiner England are right on. And there were a lot of rock people, you know, the Kinks were doing that then, and others as well, had this kind of sense that, you know, it's a dream and we've been sold out and all of that. But her criticisms of that I think are quite sort of trenchant, but then that she wraps it up in this like not very well veiled sort of, I don't know, homophobia, or at least sort of like stereotyping of the film, because I think it's a lot more complex than that, the movie. Yeah, and it is trying to do a lot of things that some of them are contradictory. But that's kind of what makes it fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I mean, Jarman is interested in digging the past to kind of find a way to express trauma that comes from there. And I think it makes sense to connect that past with the current reaction towards oppression, or some sort of like, you know, fascism involved in everywhere now. And it's important always, like, there's like a history behind why we get oppressed, or why we feel like an outsider in a specific culture. And it's always about the, you know, there's like always a behind story to that. And I think even though punk can be like associated with, like, you know, there's no past and no future, that it's like a break from traditions and the kind of the whole rhetoric of modernism or civilization. You know, you just break from that and you just like go primal. That's one of the perspectives that you can find within the literature, or like people who are into punk. But I think there are other people who tried to connect the historical developments with the emergence of punk and
well, let's on that sort of note talk a little bit about punk cinema more specifically, because your papers that I've seen and your presentations that kind of led me to think about this, I find very fascinating. So tell me if I'm wrong about this, but I think you see that there's a difference, or maybe there's an overlap between what you call punk cinema or punk films and films about punk, and that they're not always the same. Can you say a little bit about that, and then maybe we can go on from there?
Yeah, I mean, there are a few books titled punk cinema, and now when you look at how the term is used, punk cinema, it seems to be like a kind of a category that includes films about punks and punk subculture and bands and documentaries and mockumentaries or rockumentaries and just like the stories of those bands and those people that we associate with punk. And there are a lot of them. And that's kind of, that makes sense because these films are about like the punks that a lot of people know of. Right. So that speaks to the kind of accessibility and that mainstream side of things. But yeah, I kind of like try to argue that it's like, if punk is some sort of an activity and resistance, that it doesn't have to be about the famous figures from the punk history. But I don't necessarily like try to redefine punk cinema as a category, because if this term is used in that way to kind of categorize films about the punk figures and punk music, then that's the way the term is used. So right. I kind of, I don't necessarily, it can change in time, but I'm not interested in like kind of defining what punk cinema should be or what kind of films should be included in that category or whatnot. Because that's like, people have been doing that, there's like a encyclopedical film, a book called Destroy All Movies, which tries to chart all the movies that the collectors could reach to that have either a punk music in their soundtrack, a person who looks like punk, it's from like mainstream films to the very obscure European cinema. They kind of like try to like encyclopedically chart all those from A to Z. And they call the book Destroy All Movies, because it's basically, if you try to do that, it's like almost like an impossible project to.
Right.
Because they're, and then it comes down to, well, how do we define punk? Because, is like you said, before we started recording, Greg Araki movies, are they, some people consider them quite punk. Or even like when you look at it, Fight Club is like seen as like a punk movie, which is like quite a mainstream.
What's punk about Fight Club?
I mean, I don't necessarily think Fight Club is punk, but that I meant to say that like that it is considered punk by people.
Yeah, so if somebody, I'm just curious, if somebody,
it's because I guess like.
Tear down the system.
Yeah, like it's anti-establishment. It's kind of self-reflexive to how you comply with capitalist system, and then kind of starting to create some kind of anarchic explosion to kind of attack that system itself, and at the end, kind of enjoy the scenery with an heterosexual happy ending. So it's like.
Yeah.
Really? I don't know.
What are the in the literature of I want to ask you something first and I'll come back to that. Is there a discipline, punk studies, or is it part of kind of literature, music, film? Does it exist on its own? Is it a kind of a multi or interdisciplinary?
I think, I don't know who decides what becomes a field of study, basically. But if you're studying it, I guess it's a field of study. But there are a lot of research being done on punk and a lot of books, and there is a journal dedicated to it called Punk and Post-Punk Journal. And then you come across a lot of like issues special issues in by different journals in different fields, like sociological journals have issues on punk subculture. Sociology is generally like the kind of like the bigger field that involves studies on punk and Dick Hebdage's book Subcultures, being subculture, the meaning of style being one of like the key reading in that literature. And there are a lot of resources that kind of, I think like you can call that, it's almost like a field in itself now, that a mixture of sociology, a mix like musicology. In my case, it's film studies. I guess like you can say even pedagogy. That there are a lot of like studies being done, like punk pedagogies. I think there's like a book coming out or already published.
Okay.
I would recommend people like kind of like using punk methods in the classroom,
right?
To reach, to promote creativeness. It's kind of reached out to a lot of different fields now. So I guess in those like combinations that you can find, like a core punk studies, kind of emerging.
So punk studies, like punk itself, as we talked about at the beginning, has probably sort of changed, and like every academic discipline does, like things come and go and fads arise and stuff. Like what's sort of hot or cool or interesting or what people are into in punk studies these days?
I guess these days there's just so much, like I said before, there's just so much to dig into that haven't been written about, in terms of like bands, in terms of different experiences people had. Like I edited a series of essays like a few years ago, where there was a paper in feminist punk bands in Brazil who are actually quite involved in the activism against the homophobic and misogynistic governmental practices,
right.
And they are actively on the streets. Or there was another paper who was about occupying schools and trying to change the education system. And those kind of like resistant cultures intersect a lot in a lot of places. I just recently finished reading Rachel Garfield's book. Do I have it here? Actually, I have it here. Experimental Filmmaking and Punk. And it's about like a lot of female filmmakers from the 70s and 80s making black and white, mostly black and white, 8mm, 16mm art films, like experimental films. Very low budget, very like fragmented, some of them like disturbing, let's say, or dealing with the body, dealing with the sexism, dealing with a lot of different experiences of, I guess, women. So the writer is like contextualizing punk film through that experience, through that lens of like feminist experimental filmmaking. So that's one of like the current ones that I'm just like, that comes to my mind because I'm actually writing a review of it now. So it's, I guess, like I would recommend people, if they're interested in the current research, to check out the Punk and Post-Punk Journal. They generally, they have quite a broad range of things, and they can find historical research there, pedagogy stuff, a lot of reviews. But there's a lot happening. Like you can find like an article on The Guardian every week
about punk,
related to punk, yeah. Or
cool,
like kind of like Johnny Rotten commenting on something.
Yeah, I know. He's praising the Queen or trashing this. Have you seen the Sex Pistols series on the Danny Boyle one?
Yet.
No.
Not yet. Okay. I will see it eventually.
Yeah. I've seen the first 2 episodes. It's fun so far.
It is.
That's yeah. I didn't want to take up too much of your time, too much more. Thank you for being here. I told you I had a couple just fun questions at the end, so I'm going to ask you, but I have to remember what they were. All right. You don't have to answer if you don't. Oh, yeah. If you could travel through time to any punk scene where you could hang out for like 6 months or a year and just kind of be part of the scene, maybe since you're a musician, maybe even play in the scene. Is there like a punk scene you would most like to experience and be part of if you could?
I mean, the first thing that comes to my mind is obviously a Riot Girl that came about Olympia, Washington, and a lot of bands like L7 and Slater Kinney.
That's mostly like the Pacific Northwest of the US.
Yes,
kind of.
Yeah. But also the reason that I would like to be involved in it, because it seems like the history of it, that it is like that people were influencing each other. And there's like a kind of close-knit situation where, you know, the hardcore scene got super misogynistic and there was a necessity to kind of create some sort of a policy to kind of accommodate people who didn't feel safe in the hardcore scene. And that's kind of like the kind of politics of Riot Girl kind of came from that resistance to the misogyny in the 90s hardcore scene. So it's like
so it was already kind of like baked in. It wasn't.
Yeah, it emerged. Yeah, it emerged from the hardcore scene actually, because they're kind of closely connected, because girls wanted to do hardcore, and then it was, or like, you know, queer people. So it wasn't easy for them in the hardcore scene to engage with the music they like because of that gatekeeping thing that you were talking about, or just the behavioral problems of like, you know, boys bringing the patriarchal mindset into the mosh pit, you know?
Yeah.
Or like just not realizing even the kind of that they were doing that. And they needed to be reminded that, look, what you're doing is not inclusive.
Yeah.
And some cared and some didn't, as always happens. And then it's like, it's a point where you go like, oh, I need my own scene. I'm done with this.
Yeah.
And
cool.
And I, in that sense, like I kind of like I don't know if you've ever heard of this subculture Queercore. It's kind of developed in the kind of from the gay hardcores in Canada and San Francisco, where they started a zine called Homocore.
Okay.
And basically these fanzines, this fanzine.
Was this in the 90s also?
Late, that's like mid 80s actually.
Okay.
Going into 90s. And then it was like they kind of like shared this fanzine. They liked gays who liked the hardcore music or were making hardcore music were being harassed. And then they were like, the slogan was like, we're going to put the gay back in punk. Or like put the punk in gay as well. Because the gay culture was like kind of getting mainstreamized as well, like as it happens. Right. So it was like that kind of, you know, clash. And then it's actually Queercore didn't exist at all. And then in Canada, there are like a bunch of people that I love this band called Fifth Column. Started by I mean, a lot of people, but it was like the main figure that's known is GB Jones. And she was like a feminist hardcore. Who were close friends with this filmmaker, Bruce LaBruce. And he's still making a lot of gay porn films and punk films. Quite underground still, you know, like it's one of the rare examples really. It's because, I mean, he still kind of incorporates pornography quite a lot in his work. And that's the way to the underground, you know.
That's one way.
Yeah, one way. Anyway, so I think I would like to be involved in that kind of, you know, queercore environment where it actually didn't happen and they acted like they had the scene. They were like writing fanzines in the fanzines. Oh, there's this amazing queercore scene. We're going to put the gay back in the punk. And Fifth Column was like the band, but like it wasn't really like there was nothing, like it was like a bunch of people. And they acted like, and Gus Van Sant actually talks about this, where he says that he goes to Canada and he's friends with Bruce. And he's like, show me the queercore scene, man, let's go. And like, you know, he's curious about the queercore, and Bruce is like, I mean, it's just that gay bar over there, you know, like it's not, it doesn't really exist. Like, and then it actually starts, you know, producing music, because people who see the fanzine thinks that, oh, I want to get involved, and they start,
they gravitate towards it.
Yeah, and there's actually a great book on that queercore, like this academic Karen Nolt, I think. It's like a great book that kind of traces the story with the queercore, and I kind of feel most kind of, you know, I just love that story a lot, that it didn't exist and it kind of made itself,
birthed itself,
like, and that's like quite a combination of like queerness and punkness in one place, and that's kind of, I feel like that's been the closest to my experience of punk, and I'd like to be there, and I love Fifth Column music so much, and it's one of my musical influences.
Cool. I should
that
say,
was a very, very long answer. I hear you need to cut out some parts of it.
It's okay. I should say on that topic, though, because I didn't read it at the top, I don't think, that the title of your PhD thesis is Punk Aesthetics in Cinema, the Intersections of Punk Movements, Queer Histories, and Subcultural Filmmaking. Just one more sort of fun question. I was going to ask you about albums, but you thought I was going to ask you about movies, so I'll just ask you about movies. What are 5 punk movies that you think everybody should see, or that if someone came to you and said, I want to get into punk cinema, what are some films that they should see?
You already talked about Jubilee by Derek Jarman. I think that's like, I consider that film is like the kind of transition point between that established category of punk cinema about films about Sex Pistols and Julian Temple, or documentaries about, you know, Iggy Pop or Patti Smith or whatnot. To, it's like a transition point to like maybe like a looser use of the term punk in terms of cinema, like punk aesthetics in cinema. That's the kind of term I used. But Jubilee is like would also be involved in the punk cinema category in all the books that you can find on punk cinema. Jubilee would be there as like, but people generally don't, you know, when you read the kind of literature on Jubilee, they don't necessarily go into the queer aspects or gay aspects of it, but that's what I try to fill the gap in there. But otherwise, the kind of other stuff is like I already mentioned Besma, like the French filmmaker Virginie Despentes. She's also like, she's, I think, almost like more known with her punk writing. And she's like, I feel like Besma is like a very ultimate punk film in my head, because that's where I started as well. It's from 2000s, so it's actually shot on this DV little cassettes. You know, it cannot be stored. You know, you cannot get more punk than that. Like you cannot actually make the film more, you know, quality, visually cleaner. You can't do it. Bruce King, his first film called No Skin Off My Ass would be, again, like it's about a hairdresser fetishizing a skinhead, and then
like a right-wing skinhead, or just a sort of standard model?
Well, the skinhead has almost no character. It's just, you know, like it's a skinhead boy.
The aesthetics of him.
Yeah. The aesthetic of it. So like Bruce like actually engages with that idea. It's like fetishizing a skinhead, and then to a point, like it's a happy ending, so they have sex at the end. And it's like a really, really fun film to watch. The music, it's actually like it's a very pastiche, like cut up film, because it has like dialogues from other films and just incorporated into the it's actually based on a Robert Altman film, Cold Day in the Park. I think it's like late 60s, but we need to check again.
Could be late 60s, but yeah.
Before MASH. So Bruce actually like adapted that story. In that story, like, you know, I mean, yeah, people can check if they're curious.
Okay.
What else? I mean, John Waters is one I think is like the early John Waters is I feel the ultimate punk cinema. Like his first two films, Multiple Maniacs and Mondo Trasho. Actually, when you look at them, they are quite similar to a few key punk cinema films, like the punk rock movie about the London punk scene, and then Blank Generation about the New York CBGB scene. In terms of aesthetics, like early John Waters is like very, very similar to that. Like just like, especially like the kind of asynchronicity between sound and image. They're just like random music at the, I mean, not random obviously, but
seemingly
music
random.
Seemingly random music at the background that has nothing to do what's going on in the moving image, you know. Or it's related to the image, but they're never in sync. So it's generally the kind of early punk cinema that has that. And John Waters did that before even the punk documentaries, those ones that I mentioned came about. So I think it's kind of important to note John Waters made films very collectively. Like he literally had Dreamlanders, like the kind of production company. He used his own bedroom and his friends in his films and called it Dreamland Productions, where it was like just his friend group in Baltimore. So another one would be the first film by Pedro Almodovar, Pepe Lucy Bomb, 1980. That's actually because Almodovar was involved in the punk subculture in Madrid, which has a specific name called La Movida Madrileña. I don't know, my pronunciation in Spanish is really bad, but it's like
basically. You should see what I do on this channel with pronunciation. It's awful.
Love that. Bad pronunciation is the way. Yeah. So that film is great. It's about three queer women again. Okay. One of them actually is from like a punk band that existed at the time. It still exists, Alaska.
I don't know this film.
Yeah, you should check it out. It's like one of the other, important ones that I think gets lost in the category.
Okay, cool. Great. Thank you so much for all your time and this is fascinating. And I could go on and on about it, but that would not be good for
sorry for you giving so long answers. Like I
think that's
I did have like a few bullet points, and I was like, don't go over time, but how these things go. So thanks so much for inviting me.
When I started this channel, my idea was going to be I was going to make these little 15-minute videos where I talk about a movie and I say a little about the script and usually my videos are about 45 minutes. So I know how it is to go over. I want to cut them, but then I'm like, oh, that part's good. So they end up being too long. But thank you so much. This has been great, and I'm really thankful that you could be here. So that was wonderful. Oh, I wanted to ask real quick, and I'll put links in the description. But if there's you have some writing that people could read.
Yes, it's on my academia or ResearchGate. Some of them are public. Some of them, if people press the button, request the article, I will send them.
Yeah. And you're on Twitter.
I'm on Twitter.
Yeah. And are you in a band right now?
I am.
Do you guys have any gigs going, or for people who are in the Galway area?
In Ireland, we played a few gigs recently because the gigs are back finally, and we are in the process of recording our first EP.
Oh, cool. What's the name of your band?
It's called Special Issue.
Okay, cool. Special Issue.
And we are all on Instagram if people want to find us there.
The band is on Instagram, Special Issue. Yeah. Okay.
Special Issue XOX.
XOX, nice.
That's not part of the title, it's part of the Instagram name.
Okay. It's just Special Issue is the band. Special Issue XOX is the Instagram. Cool. All right. Cool. Well, thank you so much. This has been awesome.
Are you in a band?
I am not in a band right now, but I have some people that I jam with. We're actually meeting next Tuesday. but we just found out that our bass player is dropping out because he's starting law school in September. So there's me and a guitar player and a singer, and we're all none of us are from Ireland. So the guitar player is from Spain and the singer is from Argentina, and the bass player was from Italy. So we just meet in a rehearsal space and bang out a weird collection of songs. No punk yet, but yeah, the Offspring.
I like the sound of the weird combination of sounds. That sounds great.
It's fun. We'll see if anything. We just started in the spring, so it's kind of new.
Let me know if it goes like if you.
Yeah, right now we're just trying to learn some songs and having fun. So who knows? Okay, thanks a lot. Okay. I'll see you soon.
Thank you. See you soon.
Thanks for watching, everybody. This is Movie Talk with Aaron Hunter. I'm Aaron Hunter, and that was Temmuz Gürbüz, who has a PhD in film studies, whose work focuses on punk cinema and queer aesthetics, and that was awesome. Thank you so much, Temmuz, for taking part in this and for spending this really hot, for Ireland, really hot summer day on the phone with headphones in a silent room and all that sort of stuff with me. It's massively appreciate it. For everybody else, please stay tuned. I'll be back with more punk cinema, what makes this film great videos very soon. And I've got another My Movie Memories coming up. If you've stuck it out this far, please hit the like button. Please subscribe. Please consider supporting me on Patreon. But whatever you do, keep watching movies.